Joseph Stalin sat in the dim light of his office, the smell of cheap tobacco hanging heavy in the air. A folder lay on his desk, thin, unassuming, but containing a secret that could dismantle the image of the Man of Steel. When the report was finally read to him, Stalin didn't explode. He didn't scream. He didn't even look up. He stared at the paper for a long, agonizing minute. What he said next was never meant to be heard by the Soviet people. It wasn't a command to a general or a decree to the masses. It was a cold, whispered admission that changed the DNA of the war. But to understand why he reacted this way, and why it terrified the men standing in that room, we need to rewind 48 hours. In the early weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Kremlin was a place of frantic, yet calculated confidence. Stalin believed the Soviet Union was a machine, and he was the only one with his hand on the lever. The Red Army was massive. The resources were infinite. On the map spread across his heavy oak tables, the lines of defense looked solid. To Stalin, the situation was stable. Orders were simple, not one step back. He viewed the battlefield not as a place where men died, but as a mathematical equation where he held the advantage. Intelligence reports confirmed that while the Germans were pushing, the Great Patriotic War would eventually swallow them whole. His eldest son, Yakov Dzhugashvili, was out there somewhere. But in Stalin's mind, Yakov was just another gear in the machine. He was a battery commander, doing his duty like millions of others. There was no special treatment because, in Stalin's world, the state came before the bloodline. Control was absolute. Everything was proceeding according to a design that only Stalin truly understood. What none of them realized, not the generals, not the inner circle, and certainly not Stalin, was how wrong that assumption was. Then the reports stopped lining up. It started with a missing transmission from the 14th Howitzer Regiment. A small detail, a glitch in the communication lines, the generals claimed. But then a second report failed to arrive. Then a third. In the chaos of the German Blitzkrieg, entire divisions were vanishing into pockets, encirclements that cut off thousands of men from Moscow. One specific detail reached the desk of a low-level intelligence officer, a sighting of a high-ranking officer's son near the front lines of the Ula River. It was a footnote, a rumor among refugees. It was ignored. The high command was too busy trying to stop the German tanks to worry about a single battery commander. But the silence from Yakov's sector grew louder. While the Soviet propaganda machine was telling the world that the Red Army was holding the line, the reality was leaking through the cracks. A shadow was falling over the Dzhugashvili name, and the first whispers of a missing son began to circulate in the hallways of the Kremlin. That decision to ignore the first signs of the breakthrough would haunt them. Instead of slowing down or ordering a tactical retreat to find his kin, Stalin doubled down. He issued Order Number 270. It was a brutal, unforgiving decree. Any soldier who surrendered was a traitor. Their families would be arrested. Their honor would be stripped. By raising the stakes this high, Stalin thought he could force the reality of the war to bend to his will. Pulling back now or showing concern for a single soldier, even his own son, would be admitting something worse, that control was already gone. Reports began to flood in from the German side. They weren't just winning, they were collecting trophies. The German 12th Panzer Division had closed a trap near Vitebsk. Thousands were captured. Among the sea of ragged, exhausted Soviet soldiers, the Germans were looking for someone specific. They had heard the rumors too. Then came the radio intercept, a German broadcast gloating. They claimed to have a prize that would break the Soviet spirit. That's when the situation crossed the point of no return. Behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the public eye, Stalin's demeanor shifted. This is the moment history books often gloss over. When the news was officially confirmed that Yakov hadn't died in battle, but had been taken alive, Stalin's inner circle braced for an earthquake. He didn't mourn. He didn't ask about Yakov's health. According to those present, his first reaction was one of pure vitriolic disgust. To Stalin, his son had committed the ultimate sin. He had allowed himself to be caught. In his private quarters, Stalin muttered a sentence that chilled his subordinates. He didn't speak of Yakov as a son, but as a failure of the state. He whispered that he didn't even have a son named Yakov. He began to scrub the boy from his mind, even as the Germans began dropping leaflets over Soviet lines. These leaflets showed Yakov smiling, well-fed, and safe, urging other Soviet soldiers to follow his lead and surrender. The psychological war had begun. Stalin was being backed into a corner by his own flesh and blood. The Germans made an offer, a swap. They wanted their field marshal, Friedrich Paulus, back in exchange for the boy. The world waited. The generals held their breath. Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, recalled the tension in the house. The way her father looked at Yakov's portrait with a mixture of hatred and cold indifference. But he didn't say his final answer out loud. Not yet. From that moment on, nothing moved the same way again. The war became personal, but not in the way a father feels for a child. It became a war of egos. Stalin's refusal to acknowledge Yakov's humanity meant that the Soviet soldiers saw their leader as something more or less than human. Orders became reactions. Every move Stalin made on the Eastern Front was now viewed through the lens of a father who had disowned his own blood to prove a point. The human cost was staggering. Stalin ordered the arrest of Yakov's wife, Yulia. If the son was a traitor for being captured, the daughter-in-law was a conspirator. Strategy became survival. The Soviet high command realized that if Stalin was willing to sacrifice his own son to the German propaganda machine, he would sacrifice every single one of them without a second thought. The atmosphere in the Kremlin turned from cold to sub-zero, and this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Yakov was still alive in a camp, waiting for a father who had already pronounced him dead. Then came the legendary final refusal. When the Red Cross approached Stalin with the German offer to trade a field marshal for a lieutenant, Stalin uttered the line that defined his legacy. "I do not trade a marshal for a soldier." This wasn't just a decision, it was the moment Stalin realized power has limits, and to keep his power, he had to lose his soul. He chose the man of steel persona over the man. Yakov eventually died in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Some say by throwing himself against the electric fence. Others say he was shot while trying to escape. But the real reveal happened years later, in a quiet moment when Stalin was alone. He was heard saying that Yakov couldn't even shoot straight, a reference to a failed suicide attempt Yakov had made years before the war. Even in death, Stalin could only view his son through the lens of incompetence. The moment revealed that for Stalin, the Soviet Union wasn't a collection of people. It was a monument to his own will, and a monument doesn't have a family. This leaves us with a question that history has never been able to settle. Was Stalin's refusal to save his son the ultimate act of leadership, proving that no one, not even the leader's family, is above the law of the state? Or was it the ultimate failure of a human being, the moment judgment failed and gave way to a monstrous ego? If you were in that chair, with the weight of a collapsing empire on your shoulders, would you have traded the marshal, or would you have let your son die to save the image of the revolution? The debate started in the Kremlin in 1941, and it hasn't stopped since. Let us know in the comments. Was he a hero of the state, or a father who failed his final test?